I think most of us realize the impact the way we use our money is going to have on our lives right now. But I wonder if as many of us recognize the impact the way we use our money is going to have on our lives literally forever. It's probably because we don't realize that impact that Jesus tells the story he does at the beginning of Luke chapter 16. It's a little bit of a complicated story, actually. There are some who would say it's the most confusing parable Jesus tells. Now, I'm not sure about that, but it is clear that this story is about money, and we know that because of the way the Pharisees responded when they heard it. Luke says that they ridiculed Jesus. In other words, they became angry. And he adds that the reason they became angry was because they were lovers of money. Now, it's not surprising that the Pharisees understood Jesus to be talking about money because as we look at the story, we'll see that Jesus uses the word wealth several times and the word money as well. Jesus is talking about the way we use our possessions. And he's primarily talking to those of us who are Christians. Luke says in Luke 16, verse 1, and he said to his disciples, the word disciples means followers of Christ, and he's using it to refer to those of us who actually are believers. Jesus is talking to us as Christians. And he tells a strange, shocking little story in order to motivate us to think about the way we use our possessions. If you're not thinking about the way you use your possessions, if you're not thinking about money, you're not a mature Christian. If you want to be a mature Christian, you have to think about the way you use your money. Jesus says there was a rich man who had a manager. Now, another word for a manager is the word steward, but that's not a word we use all that often anymore, so it's not really very helpful. But a manager is someone a rich person would hire to help with his administrative tasks. Obviously, when you become prosperous, sometimes life gets busy. And if you own a couple businesses or a large farm, you might have too much to do, and so you'll need to hire someone who will act as your representative. And really, that's what this manager did. He was a treasurer, he was an accountant, he was a salesperson, he was a customer representative, all wrapped up in one. And in this story, he's not doing a very good job. The manager actually hears that he's wasting his possessions, and he believes what he hears, and so he decides that he's going to have to fire him. And he calls this manager to himself, and he tells him that he has a little time to get his accounts in order, and then he's going to have to let him go. And this creates a crisis. That's a big part of the story. The manager is facing a crisis. I don't know if you've ever been fired, but being fired is a scary experience. And this manager was scared because he knew that he wasn't really strong enough to work out in the fields. And he was too proud to beg. He had a position of some authority, and so he didn't want to go down, all the way down to begging. So he spent some time thinking. He didn't have a lot of time, but the time he did have, he spent thinking, and he came up with an idea, a solution, a plan. He was facing a crisis, and he made a plan. And the plan that he made was actually a bit of a sneaky one. He calls the master's debtors to himself, and obviously these men owed his master money, and they owed his master a lot of money. And he starts wiping their debts off one by one. The first man owed all kinds of oil, like 3.5 years' wages worth of oil, actually. And the second man owed about 7 years' wages of wheat. And he cuts their debts in half. And of course, they're ecstatic. They're overjoyed, which puts the master, when he finds out about it, in a very awkward position. This is a honor-shame culture, which meant that honor meant a lot, and shame was something to be avoided at all costs. And when these men, their debts had been erased, of course they went back to the village, and they were saying all kinds of great things about the master because the the manager acted as the master's representative, and so they were honoring the master all over town, I imagine, talking about the man who forgave their debts. And it would have been shameful at that point for the master to go back and say, well, actually, no, I didn't forgive your debts. He couldn't do anything like that, and he couldn't go after the manager either. The manager had seen the crisis coming, and he had come up with this amazing plan to make friends for himself, so that after the master fired him, he would have people who would love him and who would receive him into their homes. And it's a little bit of a sneaky plan when you think about it. And that's probably the part of this parable that's actually most confusing to us. And there are some who try to make the manager's acts less sneaky than they really are, because they just don't see how Jesus could use this manager as an example for us. And that's actually exactly what Jesus does. He's using this manager as a lesson for those of us who are his followers. And he's saying, look at this man. Look at this man. I'm not recommending what he did. He's a dishonest manager, but look at him. He was facing a crisis, and he came up with a plan to make friends for himself so that his future would be more secure. Now, he's an unbeliever, but look at this unbeliever and learn from him as believers, because we're all going to face a crisis. And what that means is there's a day coming when we're all going to die. It's much more serious than being fired. We're all going to die, and we're going to stand before God, and we're going to be judged. And if worldly people are smart enough to look at the future they have and to come up with plans to use their material possessions to secure their earthly future, we as believers who know that life is much longer than this life, that we're going to stand before God and then we're going to enter into eternity, we should be wise enough to use the material resources we have now to make friends for ourselves who will welcome us when we enter into heaven. In other words, what Jesus is saying is the way you use your possessions, it not only impacts your life now, it impacts your life literally forever. If unbelievers are smart enough to spend time thinking about how to use their possessions so they can have a more secure, a better, more prosperous 20 or 30 years, we as believers should be thinking carefully about how to use the resources God has given us to honor him and to make friends for eternity. Now, how do you do that exactly? Where do you start? Next time we get together, I want to look at this story that Jesus tells, and specifically the applications he makes as a result of it, in order to give you some help planning your future and using your material possessions for your long-term eternal good.